Welcome back to another podcast here on TarHeelIllustrated.com. This is THI publisher Andrew Jones, and a very special edition of the podcast series here for you today as I welcome aboard one of my favorite people in media, someone I believe is one of the great legendary sports writers in ACC history, Mr. Barry Jacobs. I urge all of you to Google his name. You can find all of his work. Hit Google, all kinds of stuff's going to come up. And if you haven't read the book, Three Paths to Glory, about the 1993 season in the Triangle, I recommend that you do so. It's an awesome piece of work. My friend Barry Jacobs, welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. Good to be here. Always good to talk to you. And as you said before we started, we'll keep it clean, unlike in the press room.
Yeah, I know. That's the hardest thing about me doing podcasts. I did radio for years, and one time I let a cuss word through, and of course we had the 7-second delay. And the only way we would get it fixed here is if Jacob edits it out, and he may just let it slide by just for humor purposes. But yeah, we'll keep it clean here, and there's a lot of interesting stuff we want to hit on. With all the hysteria, with all the popularity, the chatter about the Michael Jordan documentary series that started the other day on ESPN, you were the person that first came to my mind that I wanted to talk to you about this. Typically, I wouldn't do MJ all the time stuff because it's so overdone in so many respects. However, the documentary was so good and took people to a place with MJ at Carolina that most people, if anyone, had really never been before. The only people that really kind of saw Jordan in that light during that time, and I can still talk about it, are guys like you, guys that covered him back then and that had the perspective, have a perspective now that I think is really interesting. And we've chatted a little bit about Michael over the years, and one story that we were just talking about a second ago, which I'm looking forward to hitting on, the Dan Dockich element here in just a minute. But what I think would be really useful to people, Carolina fans, just people who care about Michael Jordan and care about great athletes, is your perspective of covering him at the time. And from when he got to Carolina and just watching the evolution from Mike to Michael and the Dean Smith component during those years. So going back when he first arrived at Carolina, what were some of the earliest memories that you have of covering him and what you saw from him that you kind of thought was interesting and maybe different than most of the guys that you were covering back in the day?
Well, I was just starting to cover ACC basketball full-time about the time he came on board, 82, then 83. I was there at Keenan. They showed an image of the team coming back from winning the national championship, and it looked like there were thousands of people out there. That's because there were thousands of people out at Keenan. And he was just a part of a team that, at the beginning, that had carefully controlled media access. Media used to joke that there was a party line and all the players stuck to it, and the ones who didn't were the ones that you sought out. And one of the best was actually the North Carolina High School Player of the Year in the year that Michael Jordan came out, and that was Buzz Peterson. Buzz was a little less disciplined in answering your questions. Michael was pretty shy at the beginning, not apt to veer too much from what he knew Coach Smith wanted him to say. And mostly it was you just absorbed what he was doing when he was playing. And then over the time he was at Carolina, I had more opportunities to do a couple of sit-downs with him, not doing it because I thought I was doing it for historical purposes, but because he was an important player on the team. And he was an enjoyable person to speak with, well-spoken, not a lot of likes and don'ts, very mannerly, good guy.
When I thought it was interesting the other day when watching the documentary when James Worthy said that Michael thought he was the best player when he got there, but after about 2 weeks he really was. Did you have any inclination early on that he would become a great college player? Not what he did with the Bulls, just become a great college player? Because at that time they had so many terrific, highly regarded kids that were coming to the program on a regular basis. So many of them would come in and accept subservient roles, and they kind of wait their time. He was a rare freshman who started, but that also, to me, one of the misnomers about that roster, that's not one of the great deep rosters that Dean had. He had a great starting five, a couple of guys off the bench, and then there wasn't a whole lot filling out the roster. So MJ started, but he kind of had to start because he was one of the 5 best players. They didn't have a lot of great talent on that team. So did you have any inclination that maybe this guy would develop into a terrific college player?
No, not as a freshman, although in thinking about speaking with you, I did write a story after his freshman year for the Sporting News about what an exceptional player this guy was and how he could be a great player. So I guess almost 40 years ago, I did have an inkling, but my recollection is more colored by watching him over time and having talked to him. There are a couple of things that have stood out to me ever since, one of which is that he told me at one point that he gained a reputation as being a really clutch player. And what he told me was that he studied what his opponent was doing to guard him in the first half. And then in the second half, he took advantage of what they were doing. And that's why he seemed like he was much more explosive in the second half. And I haven't heard him talk about that as a pro. And maybe he just turned it on all the time and that was what switched. But I guess it must have been as a sophomore, because I'm not sure how conscious he was of the totality of his game as a freshman, what freshman would be. But, I don't think he knew. I don't think, as Coach Smith says in the documentary, they didn't know. They have David Falk saying, his agent, that he was one of the top recruits in the country. Well, that wasn't even true. He wasn't even discovered nationally until he went to, from what I understood, 5-star in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, but after his junior year in high school. Carolina had him at their camp, so they knew he was good. But nobody else really knew that Mike Jordan was that good a player. And I think he figured it out earlier than most players. I was thinking, if we were going to talk about him, one of the things is how many times he made the NBA all-defensive team. And I interviewed him the summer between his freshman and sophomore years, and he was telling me what Coach Smith wanted him to work on. One was his ball handling, and one was his defense. And I was thinking, okay, by the time he was a junior, Dean let him be like a free safety. He could do whatever he wanted. And there was that one play against Maryland, I think it was in '84, where it was a very close game at Carmichael, and Lefty Driesell thought he'd trick Carolina by having the ball inbounded by his son, Chucky. And then the ball was passed back to Chucky for a layup. And he went in for the layup, and Michael Jordan came from one side, way like top of the key, and Sam Perkins came from the other side, and they both blocked the shot, and the ball went out of bounds. And there was still time on the clock, but of course the officials, scorekeeper, let the clock run out, which drove Lefty crazy, and he came running toward Dean with his fist raised. And Bill Guthridge ran out to meet him with his fist raised. We almost had a Rick Barnes, Dean Smith kind of confrontation. But that was one of the greater defensive reactions that I had ever seen anybody make. It was coming from the top of the key to block that shot. That wasn't expected. So I've been thinking how many players I ever saw in the ACC anyway, who had that kind of freedom and ability. And I can only think of 2, and I apologize, they both went to Duke. One was Grant Hill, who didn't realize how good he was until he was in the NBA for a couple of years. He said to me, after a couple of years, I went down to Charlotte to see him play. He said, I didn't realize these guys aren't that athletic. I mean, I'm as athletic as they are. So he didn't grasp it as quickly as Michael did, what his abilities were. And the other was Shane Battier, who was an incredible defensive player and had the freedom, but he was never a great offensive player. Michael did it all, and he did it quick.
I think with Shane too, having covered the tail end of his career, he knew that defense was what got him on the floor early on because he was surrounded by older, much more talented guys or polished guys at the time. With Michael, what I find interesting is that Roy Williams will often talk about a player's potential. Last summer, for example, he said, Leaky Black could play at the next level, could play in the NBA. And of course, we see Leaky Black now. Roy is kind of looking down the road and seeing a different version from what we see. Did Dean ever talk about what version he saw a kid could be down the road? And did he ever do that with Michael Jordan? Did he ever project, say, well, Michael can be this, Michael can be that? And if so, what did he say?
I think Dean generally, at least to media people and the public, tried to avoid putting too much pressure or expectation on his players. That's why he always had players listed at shorter than 7 feet tall. He would have 6'11" and a half, or he would have them measured without their sneakers on, so they would be a little bit shorter. He was big on trying to limit expectations, but it was hard not to see what incredible potential Michael had, and he talked about that. And of course, he also promoted his players, but more in the college context. I suspect that if anybody had asked him who was in the professional ranks or some of his guys like Larry Brown or Doug Moe, he would have told them very quickly how good Michael was.
One of my favorite things about covering college athletes is watching them come in as freshmen, and they're not that polished with the media. They're kind of shy. They think talking to us is really cool when they're freshmen. And by the time they're seniors, they've done it a lot. It's not that big a deal, but they're so much more polished. They really do come in as boys and they leave as men. How did Michael progress in that respect? He was only there 3 years, wasn't there a 4th year, but he had so much attention, had so many media opportunities, especially for the time. How did you see him grow in that element?
He got, as you say, he got more polished. I think he was more economical in his answers. Yes, as you mentioned, some players really enjoy talking to the media. Some players just take it as a part of the position. I don't want to say job. And some players come to hate it. Two I think of who were terrific players in college were Tim Duncan and Christian Laettner. Hated talking to the media by their senior year because they thought it was an imposition on their time with their teammates. You were coming into their locker room. They didn't want to talk about the game with you. They'd already talked to their teammates. Michael was, as I said, there was a mainstream thought process in the Carolina locker room. Coach Smith, just like coaches probably for all time, have told the players, here's what happened in the game. Here's what we want you to work on. Here's what I think you did well. And then that's what they're going to tell you happened in the game. And in those days, there weren't many other outlets. It was not so easy to get pry under or into people's lives. They weren't posting anything that revealed much about themselves. And as you say, Michael was only there 3 years. So as you were getting adjusted to who he was halfway out the door. And I don't think, as it showed in the documentary, he didn't really want to leave. Coach Smith encouraged him to leave, which of course turned out to be a pretty good decision, especially since he got hurt in the NBA not long afterward. Had that happened in college, would have been a totally different story.
Do you have an oh my goodness moment with him where you're covering a game and he did something and it just kind of changed how you watched him from that moment on?
No, I more saw him as it really was a time when there were some extraordinary players in the ACC. One of the ones that's forgotten is Len Bias. He was a terrific player. He was almost of a caliber of Michael Jordan, and we might have been talking about him now if this was a Maryland podcast. But that, as you mentioned, I actually thought it was unfair in the documentary. They kind of downplayed what a great game James Worthy had in the championship game. That was his career scoring high. Yeah. That game debunked the myth that Dean Smith never let his players have enough freedom when the game was on the line, and that's why he didn't win championships. And Sam Perkins was pretty good on that team too. So it wasn't like, okay, Michael Jordan's carrying the team. It was a group effort. And even after his freshman year when James Worthy left, Sam Perkins was still there. He is another forgotten player. He was a terrific player. And as you say, there were only about 6 guys who got used. And when Sam Perkins got the flu and was in the infirmary, they lost one of their 2 games that year. So they had a small margin of error. And I suspect that maybe part of why Michael Jordan said he watched what was going on in the first half and then took advantage of how the defense played him in the second was because at least in that first year, they paced themselves a little bit.
Well, and you go back to that game, those who saw it will remember vividly Patrick Ewing getting the goaltendings early on, kind of setting a presence and trying to kind of intimidate Carolina to keep them away from him in the lane. Well, Worthy was a forward and scored 28 points. And most of that stuff was going to the rim. Some of the great highlights that you'll see of that game are Worthy scoring to the rim. And, of course, the one Jordan layup, the left-handed layup way over Ewing's reach off the glass was an amazing play too. But, yeah, I agree. I thought that they could have given a little bit more time to the other guys. I don't even think they even mentioned Perkins. And he certainly – I haven't seen him yet in the documentary get interviewed. And he was a 3-time first-team All-America. And he was an first-team All-America that year. He was a sophomore. And the year before, started a national title game. So it's interesting that they squeezed it really on Jordan. But when you go back to that team, Barry, when you enter into a situation where a club played for the national title the year before, they've got Worthy back, they've got Perkins, they've got Jamie Black, who's established. Matt Doherty was the 6th man, I guess, or 7th man the year before, and was a starter that year. How was it for a guy like MJ kind of assimilating himself to that team? And I asked that in the context of today, we don't see assimilation as much because a lot of times you get a great player, get what you can out of him in 1 year, push him out, and you get the next guy in the next year. However, 2 years ago, when Kobe White was a freshman, we saw him assimilate, and he became an awfully good player and became fully connected with the older guys by the time they got to February that year. So going back to Michael's freshman year, how did the assimilation process take place?
Well, you have to put it all into context, as you were doing. For one thing, not many players were going pro early. It was a new thing. I was doing a story on Ralph Sampson, and I was in Charlottesville, and Al McGuire was waiting outside Terry Holland's office with me to go in and talk to him about his team. And we got into a discussion about players leaving early, and I said I thought they should stay 4 years. He said, "What?" Finally, he said to me, "What did you go to Virginia?" I said, "No. I just think, if you make a commitment, you should stay. The team recruits around you. It's better for you. You can get your degree, all that stuff," which now seems so archaic and naive. But back then, a guy, and one of my pet peeves is Michael Jordan was not the greatest player to play in the ACC. He was the greatest player who played in the ACC. But David Thompson, who was the greatest, stayed all 4 years. There was little thought of him going early. Each year, some NBA team or ABA team tried to get him to leave, but he stayed 4. Ralph Sampson, who was the 3-time ACC Player of the Year, stayed 4. So it wasn't much in the player's thought process like it started to be. Even when Worthy went in '82, that was an exception. Bob McAdoo had gone early, but he only was at Carolina 1 year. The other part of the context is you became inculcated in the Dean Smith system. And when you came as a freshman, and that's why they didn't take transfers. He had, I think, 2 junior college transfers his entire career, Dean, in 36 years. When you were a freshman, you carried the film projector. You waited to drink last in practice. That was just how it worked. There was a hierarchy, and of course we all know until the first game you couldn't do an interview. So you just learned very quickly that you were supposed to subordinate to the group. In a way, it's kind of Dean. One of my favorite Dean Smith quotes is, "The only free person is a disciplined person." And so first he wanted to teach you how to fit in and how to be part of a structure. And then he was going to let you blossom as you could. And so I think of that 82 team. Michael Jordan was not the star of the team. People can't, looking back, how could he have not been the star of every team he was ever on? But he wasn't. And the 83 team, without Worthy, was not that great. It took a little while for them to recoup their prowess. And then in 84, they had that, Dean had one of his weirdo rules about 2,000, you had to sit out the rest of the first half, no exceptions. And that's where Dan Dockage comes in. He had in, what was it, 93 maybe, where he had so many good players, and there was such sniping within the team about playing time that he would portion it out by half minutes. When people got to play, you got 6.5 minutes here or 3.5 minutes there. You knew you were going to get your 3.5 minutes, so don't be dissatisfied. But here's how it's going to work. And he didn't have to worry about that in 82, 3, and 4, but he did have to make sure, as you were saying, that there was team unity. That was always an attribute of Carolina's teams. They were disciplined, they were unified, and they were intelligent.
The 84 team, and that's a great segue because that's what I was going to hit on next. We're gonna do the Dan Dockage thing here in a second. The 84 team was loaded with guys that had been doing it for a couple of years, and then they had some younger players that kind of filled out the roster. Kenny Smith is a freshman point guard. I think Joe Wolf and
Dave Popson.
Dave Popson were sophomores in that team. Brad Daugherty was on that team, a future number one pick.
Number 1 draft pick.
Yeah, if you look at that roster, just the names, and think about what those guys accomplished, it's hard to think of many college rosters any better than that 1984 one. But they're undefeated. Kenny Smith gets hurt against LSU. I think it was Don Redden, I believe it was, who fouled him
from behind.
Yeah, and he broke his wrist, and they were still really good. I think Steve Hale ran the point for a while, and then Kenny came back. He had the I guess his wrist was wrapped, or he had a soft cast or something like that. You can explain that there in a second. So they were the best team in college basketball. Georgetown was really, really good that year too. And it looked like they were on a collision course for another meeting with Georgetown 2 years later after the great 82 game. And they get to the Sweet 16, and they're facing Indiana in Atlanta. And it didn't work out for the Tar Heels that night. Jordan's last game, Perkins' last game, Doherty's last game. But the Dan Dockage storyline there, which I think most people watching this or listening to this have heard before, is that Dockage stopped Michael Jordan. He beat Carolina because he stopped Michael Jordan in his last game. I've never seen it exactly that way because of kind of what you were alluding to a second ago. MJ picked up the second foul, and Dean sat him, and Carolina never really got their mojo going. So you take it from there.
Well, I think that team was one of those teams that lost its chemistry. It had great chemistry until Kenny Smith got hurt. And then it did well enough, but it never quite recaptured that level of excellence that it had when he was healthy. And even when he came back, they were not quite the same. The only other team I've seen, obviously, if you get if Kendall Marshall gets hurt in the NCAA tournament, a really great team is not going to be able to recover and win a national championship in overnight. It takes a while to acclimate. The only other team I've seen that was like that was in 2011 with Kyrie Irving. Duke was a great team. And then he got hurt. And then it became Nolan Smith's team. And come the NCAA tournament, Krzyzewski tried to work Kyrie Irving back into the lineup, and they didn't have the chemistry that they had had at the beginning of the year. And they were not the same team, and they went out pretty quickly. That's what happened to Carolina in '84, is they were good. And Steve Hale did a good job. But they just weren't quite the same. And then adding to that, Dean had a rule for Michael Jordan. I was reminded of it during the documentary when the year he was injured with the Bulls and came back, and they had a minute limit per half. And if the coach let him play an extra minute, he thought he was going to lose his job. Well, Dean had his own rules, and he was inflexible in his way about the rules. And I can't swear to this, but I would. There was a famous game at Cameron Indoor Stadium where Cecil Exum was in the game because Michael had 2 fouls. And Dean wanted to put Michael Jordan back in the game. It was in the second half. He was moving him in and out of the lineup. And the scorekeeper at Duke wouldn't blow the horn to let Jordan back in the game, which obviously was an advantage for Duke. They have to remember 84, Krzyzewski is this young, hot-headed guy whose name people still couldn't spell or pronounce. And Dean wants his best player back in the game. And they wouldn't blow the horn. So he went over and he slammed his fist on the scorer's table. And for whatever reason, the score jumped by 20 points. And of course, Krzyzewski went crazy, and he wanted a technical foul on Dean, and it wasn't called. And so after the game, Dean came in first because he was the winner, and he was talking to me, and I'll never forget the mood in the press room was really light because, Dean was making jokes and, his usual indirect knocks on Duke, but, it was all in good fun, and we were all kind of still chuckling, and he left the room, and Krzyzewski stormed into the press room and denounced the double standard in ACC officiating, and that, of course, that should have been a technical foul. And it was all around getting Michael Jordan back in the game after he had foul trouble. So that was certainly in my mind when in the NCAA tournament, when Michael got 2 fouls in the first half, and he wasn't getting back in no matter what happened. And as you said, I think that was an instance where chemistry came into it. They just didn't recover their stride. It's like if you twist your ankle, you could still run. You could still run pretty close to normal, but you're not the same. And when he came back in the second half, maybe he hadn't had time to take Dan Dockage's measure on the court to know how he was going to be guarded and which hand he could use and, which shoulder he could put into him to get past him. And I always thought that because of having to sit out the first half and knowing that he used that time to study his opponent to decide how he was going to play in the second half, that it handicapped him. And of course, that handicapped Carolina.
And when I think back to that second half, he had a push. Most of his production in the game was in a stretch where they had cut the margin down and they were within a couple of buckets. But if I remember correctly, and you know it so much better because you were there all the time, it seemed kind of forced. They showed in the documentary that Celtics game when Jordan just said, look, nobody else is doing anything. I got to do it myself. That was only a couple of years later, but he was also a different player. The guy that we saw in Atlanta that night hadn't yet had the Olympic experience, hadn't yet had that rookie NBA season, still didn't have the confidence level that he would have a couple of years later. And a lot of what he was doing, he was displaying his amazing skills, his amazing gifts, but it was kind of forced. He wasn't really yet that guy that night. And I think the first half kind of put him in that frame of mind where he was sort of trying to play catch up with himself in the second half. Is that kind of how you recall that?
Yes, and I can also say something that directly contradicts something that I said earlier about James Worthy's scoring in the national championship game. Is if you were playing for Carolina, you were playing within a framework, and you were taught to play within the framework, and it was difficult to just turn it on and step outside the framework and do what Jordan did in the NBA, where he didn't have the same respect for the framework he was in. In the NBA, he was encouraged to do what he did. In college, he was encouraged to fit within the system. In fact, the old joke by Marty Blake, who was the preeminent NBA scout, was that Dean Smith was the only person who ever held Michael Jordan to under 20 points a game. And of course, Michael averaged exactly 20.0 points per game under Dean, so it wasn't true. But the point was true, is that there was a limit. And if you're a 20-year-old and you have huge amount of respect for this man who deserved your respect as a basketball master, I would think it would be hard unless he told you, go, do this. James Worthy was a junior, so he knew how to do it, or he decided to do it. And the previous year, Al Wood, as a senior in the final national championship game, had his career high. So it was done, and it was done right in that period at Carolina. But I don't know if Michael was that, I don't know what the word would be, assertive as an individual when he was a junior as he was when he got to pros, and looked around at who was on his team and realized even that game you mentioned against the Celtics where he had, was it 49?
Yeah.
They were a losing team.
Yeah.
They barely edged into the playoffs. So he had to do stuff like that. At Carolina, he did not.
Yeah, that 49 was the game before he had 63, but the 49, I think, set up the 63 when he realized he just had to do all that. One of the things I thought was really interesting the other night was the amount of attention that Roy Williams got for his comment, first referring to MJ as a youngster, because nobody talks like that anymore. And then with he knew how to turn it on and off, but he never turned it off. And I thought that was a great line. And people were talking about it all over the country through social media and stuff like that. And I thought local ABC affiliate sports reporter Mark Armstrong had a great line on a tweet where he said, that's the Roy we see all the time. So what I'm getting to is the nation saw something from Roy that they generally don't. We see it all the time. When Michael left and he's in the Olympics, then he's in the NBA doing his thing, how often did you sit back and say, oh, I've seen that before. That's the guy I know. Oh, that's MJ for you. That people were discovering outside that you already knew really well about.
Yeah, he was a rare player, and you realized it before he left college. Sometimes it takes the rest of the world a while to figure it out. And of course, Portland was forever denigrated for picking Sam Bowie ahead of Michael Jordan. Of course, nobody knew that Bowie, not only wasn't he that great, but he also was injured most of his career, so he didn't have much of a career. And back then, being 7 feet was the be-all and end-all. It was a different game. Part of why Michael Jordan was as great as he was is the time he came along. His idol growing up was Charles Scott. Charles Scott's idol growing up was Elgin Baylor. Those were guys who could elevate and stay in the air, and they were big enough to be guards, but they could also be forwards. There weren't that many players like that. Now, you got guys who are 6'10" who do that. It's a different perspective now, and we are limited by the fact that we're looking backwards. But it was pretty evident to us who watched him here, fans and media, and obviously as coaches, that this was a remarkable talent who was now going to play more minutes, and was going to be less shackled. So he was going to be a revelation. And every once in a while, a player comes through, and my focus has been the ACC because I don't travel around a lot. Comes through and you think, oh my God, wait till people see this guy. And I can't really think of many others. The only one that really comes to mind to me is Tim Duncan. And Tim Duncan's game was the quintessential understated game.
Yeah.
He didn't even change expression. You know, if the Rolling Stones hadn't become known for the mouth with the tongue hanging out, that was Michael Jordan. That would have been his signature, as it was the Nike symbol became his signature for Air Jordan. But he was not only unique, but he was unexpected. And it helped to transform basketball. There was Dr. J, who was great. There was Elgin Baylor, who was great, and they were like him. But there wasn't the same publicity. There wasn't ESPN. There wasn't, sports had not taken the role in American society that it did in the mid 80s when Michael Jordan was coming along. So and then of course Nike made him a commodity. So not only was he a transcendent player creating a new role, but he came along at exactly the right time to become a cultural phenomenon. And it's hard to separate all those things. That's why I made the point before about David Thompson. David Thompson played all 4 years in college. In college, nobody was as good as him who came through the ACC. But once you expanded to the pros, David Thompson got into cocaine, fell down a flight of stairs when he was messing around in things he shouldn't have. He never had the career beyond that. And so people forget how good he was. And that's already, 45 years ago that he finished college. But Michael's career lasted another 20 years after the ACC, 15 years. And so you wound up having a sense that it was all one continuum. And, he didn't even win Player of the Year but one time, and that was after Ralph Sampson graduated.
I know.
So, his impact was really in the NBA as far as how he changed the game. And I think people started realizing, oh my God, we haven't seen this before. You could have said Connie Hawkins was like that, but who saw Connie Hawkins? And even Dr. J was playing in the American Basketball Association. It wasn't like it was, 24-hour sports on TV 7 days a week. So he just brought forth his predecessors in a way that was packaged well and that we had never seen before. And then when you add that he won championships, that made it even another level of impact.
And it continues today with the Jordan brand, with the Jumpman logo. Carolina's football practice helmets a couple of years ago simply had the Jumpman logo on there. And Jumpman isn't just UNC. I know there's some other schools that use the Jordan brand and have a lot of that too. The aura of Michael Jordan continues. And quite frankly, in a period where there's no sports right now, it exploded this past week, perhaps as much as any time when he was playing. Because if you look, I spent a lot of time there and I checking out social media. I was fascinated by the range of people that were commenting about the documentary. You had musicians, you had actors, you had pro athletes in other sports mentioning Dean Smith by name in a tweet. And these are guys that weren't born when Dean was, maybe born when Dean was coaching, but they were children. They were young kids and from another part of the country. They have no reason to know who Dean Smith was unless they're a college basketball fanatic. So the Jordan impact, the Jordan aura, the Jordan effect is ongoing. And I suspect that it will always, there will always be, like Babe Ruth is still part of lexicon. And I think Michael Jordan will be a part of that for the next century or more.
I think you're right. And you had Muhammad Ali, I think
Yep.
Uncle Wilbon or David Aldridge, one of the people interviewed in the documentary said that there are only three transcendent figures you can think of from sports that are like that. American sports anyway. And I was writing a column not that long ago, and I noticed that players were starting to let their hair grow out. And that I realized that, because having a shaved head was the thing for a long time, like baggy shorts. And then I realized Michael Jordan was 50 years old, and that not only had none of those people ever seen him play except on video, but that he wasn't really part of their world except as either an old video clip or a commercial brand. And so gradually he was not as much of a fashion setter as he had been, but he was, he's a product of another time now. It's hard for those of us who watched him play to think of it that way, but he touched all of us. We were growing up too, but we were already here. For people who weren't here, he's part of what they picked up as they grew up. I went to the Peach Jam in the summer a couple of years ago, and I asked about 15 or 20 coaches just to see what they'd say. Who's the greatest player in the history of basketball? And a lot of them did not say Michael Jordan, which was interesting. And they had good reasons. Some said Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was the highest scoring player in the history of the NBA. And he won 4 national championships in 4 years at UCLA. Pretty good. Others who were a little older said Oscar Robertson, because at that point, he was the only player to ever average a triple-double in the NBA. And his teams won national championships at Cincinnati. I always thought, and I would still make the argument, that it was Bill Russell. His teams, the Celtics, won 11 NBA championships in a 16-year career. Pretty good. Almost twice as many as Michael Jordan's Bulls won. And he was the dominating player of his era, even though Wilt Chamberlain was his nemesis, or he was Wilt Chamberlain's nemesis. But so, a lot of it is your perspective. Now people talk about LeBron James being one of the greatest players in history, which he is, but is he the greatest? I don't think, you always are put up against Michael Jordan. My point being, in a roundabout way, he's now either identified as the greatest player in the history of basketball, or you have to go through him to get to claiming any piece of the greatest, which is in and of itself a remarkable statement about his impact and its lasting impact on the other people who are interested in sports.
Your point about the transcendent athletes reminded me of a scene in the movie 48 Hours, which was 1982. And Eddie Murphy they were looking for that guy that had the money or whatever, okay? And they got into this apartment, and this woman hit him with a baseball bat. And he says to Nick Nolte, something or other, you better do something because she thinks she's Babe Ruth here. That was 47 years after Babe Ruth stopped playing. So you got to figure 47 years out from 2002, that's 2049. There might be a scene in a movie where somebody makes a Michael Jordan reference. That's how transcendent Michael, I think David Aldridge was saying that he is, and I think that's what we're saying as well. I think that people will make a Michael Jordan reference in 2049, and it won't be foreign to most people. They'll kind of understand what's being said.
And, I think it comes up in the documentary, and I also think it's worth noting he had a background in Wilmington that was both, and maybe they'll go into it more, I don't know, that was both challenging and comforting. They touched on the fact that he didn't make the varsity as a sophomore, which was he mentioned that in his Hall of Fame induction. That he used that for his entire career, and he also had a really, I thought, warm and supportive family. I actually did a story on him for People magazine. I went down and visited his family home. They were very, very accomplished, supportive, from what I could tell as an outsider. And that helps you ground yourself in who you are. And I think that carried forward really well. You know, without getting sociological or philosophical, he came from a two-parent home. He had siblings in his home that he competed with. They both of his parents worked, and so they were a middle-class family that had what they needed. They still had to deal with, and probably would still today, the racism that's part of being an African American in the United States, or most of the world, as we see in European soccer. But you know, he had a strong foundation. And then North Carolina basketball, because of how it was run and who it was run by, gave him an even stronger foundation. So I don't think he, from what I could tell, because I didn't cover him much in the NBA, I don't think he ever got lost in I'm the greatest. I'm sure he must have thought that. He would have been a fool not to think that. But it didn't affect him in a way that we so many times see it affect people, and you want to say, don't be so full of yourself. And again, Muhammad Ali was like that, but he actually said it. He said, I am the greatest. And then he had to put up. Michael didn't, I don't recall too many times ever hearing him, except to his team, say, get out of my way. Although, you know, when they played the Pistons, it was certainly get out of my way, even if you're going to try and knock the crap out of me. And that's where we're cleaning up our language.
Yes, very much so. Before we close this out, I cut my teeth in this business at I spent 10 years at the Wilmington Star News. First 5 years I lived in Wilmington, and I worked with some amazing people there. You might know who Chuck Carey is, who covered preps down there for a long time. He covered MJ when he was at Laney High School. And Brian Hendrickson, who's gone on to do amazing things in his career. When they did the initial sports century back at the end of the 90s, when they were doing all those sports centuries in the top 50 and that kind of thing, both of them were interviewed for the Michael Jordan Sports Century. Brian Hendrickson was in my wedding, one of my best friends in life. Chuck is an absolute rock star legend down there. He retired several years ago from the Star News. He was, we used to joke that he was the only non-athlete, non-family member that had Michael Jordan's cell phone number, had his home phone number. He had that kind of access. And so when I'm watching that the other night, and they're showing some of the Wilmington stuff, I was so thrilled that they had Fred Lynch on there, who was his coach at Laney, because Chuck was close to him. And when you spend time in Wilmington and you understand and learn about what's important to Wilmington, Fred Lynch was one of those names that's important down there. And when Michael retired, I guess it was the second time in '98, we ended up doing, the Star News did a book that Brian mostly wrote. I did a lot of the research. And they had me go in and look back at old newspapers, going back to when Michael was in middle school. I think he started about 5th or 6th grade. He was a great baseball player back in the day. And I'll never forget, I found this little nugget that we ended up using in the book, I think, where I think when he was in 7th grade, he threw a no-hitter against Roland Grice Middle School. And he was a baseball guy. And I love seeing one of the team photos they put up there in the documentary the other day with Michael playing baseball, because he loved baseball. He had a great baseball card collection. It was a passion of his. And of course, he went and tried to play baseball for a couple of years in a way of honoring his dad, because I think that their relationship initially, their sports relationship initially, was through baseball. And then basketball kind of took over because he was so talented. But having spent that much time in Wilmington, you hear a lot of stories about the other MJ, the MJ growing up. And a lot of times when people get rich and they get famous, they get highly successful, there's a lot of people don't like it. They kind of look at someone, they're a little bit jealous maybe. They kind of look at them as a different person. Well, they're not Wilmington anymore. They're too big for us. They're too good for us. But when I was there working at the Star News and doing radio down there, and Michael was with the Wizards, he brought the Wizards to Wilmington to train. And that was kind of his way of saying, you know, I know what he said in the documentary, but you're right. There was a comfort and there was also some problems with the whole Wilmington thing. That was him embracing the comfort side. Because Trask Coliseum is about 4 miles from his house on Gordon Road, where he grew up in. And it was really cool to see him there and the way the town received it. And some of the people that knew him said that was some of the most fun he ever had in his basketball career, was training in Wilmington because of that love and that connection to Wilmington. And it was a really neat experience for me as a young journalist to be there and kind of see that up front and see a different side of MJ. And it kind of speaks to what you were just saying. He never said he was the greatest. He didn't boast that much. Supremely confident, but didn't rub it in your face. He did that with his play. He did that with the different things that he did. And I think his way of reconnecting with Wilmington was taking that team down there toward the end of his career and still appreciating where it was he came from. So there was a genuineness about Michael Jordan that you don't always see with athletes and people in general that reach such extremes that he has in his life.
And his college roommate is still works with him or for him with the Charlotte Hornets, Buzz Peterson.
Yeah.
They've been connected all the way through. I think they both majored in geography, which I'm sure has its uses if you're a pro basketball player. At least you know where you are. And there's nothing more embarrassing than to see a politician say, "Hello, Des Moines," and be in Dubuque.
We've seen that lately.
Yes, we have. But, you know, part of why I think he has a lasting appeal is because he wasn't, pardon the word, braggadocious.
Yeah.
So many modern athletes are all about how good they are. And it's all about how much money they're making. And obviously Michael made a huge amount of money, and it was shocking to see that Scottie Pippen, who was a pretty terrific player and was indispensable to the Bulls winning 6 NBA titles, was the 122nd highest paid player in the NBA. And that wouldn't happen now, I don't think. Maybe your rookie contract. But then after that, once you go out you would go out on the open market. It was still a fairly closed shop back then. And so, you know, Michael was pretty loyal to Chicago. He's been loyal to North Carolina, even in buying the Hornets. And nobody's ever accused him of being a great manager, but you know, he's trying. He's occasionally hiring Carolina guys to help him, and he's got Buzz by his side. I don't think they tease each other anymore about who is the best high school player in North Carolina in 1981, but you know, it's still in there. I think all those things come together to make him, even with the drinking and the gambling and the other stuff, make him a likable person. Some of us, more than others, would take issue with his, like Tiger Woods, avoiding making any political statements when he had so much power to influence people's minds. LeBron James did it in the last election. It didn't help the person that he was endorsing, but he did it. And maybe that's a more modern thing too, is that back then there was a line that athletes didn't cross, coaches didn't cross, which was the line between the athletic and the political. And again, once you cross that line, you become less attractive to a large number of people who are hoping that the other person who you didn't endorse is going to win. And so he managed to kind of, in some ways, pitch down the middle his whole career. And stay on balance. You know, to use a baseball term, he's staying on balance in the batter's box his whole career. And I would say he was I believe, a better minor leaguer than Tim Tebow. He had gifts, And we were all lucky that he used them where we lived to start out his career. And then we became attached to his success without making a fuss about it. You become invested in some of these players, especially the ones who are not so full of themselves or don't want to talk to the public or the media. And he hit it just right as an athletic type and as an individual and on a team, both at Carolina and in Chicago. And so we'll all say, yeah, we were privileged to see him play. And I'll always remember that game in Carmichael where he and Sam Perkins blocked the trick layup by Chucky Drizel as one of the most amazing athletic plays I had ever seen. But also how those teams were, they only lost 2 games in 1982. That was an awesome team. And before we made so much about sports, when people list the greatest teams of all time, how many list the 1982 Carolina team? They should. And part of the reason is because of him.
And you had an amazing spot to chronicle those 3 years and so much else. And I encourage everybody to Google your name, Barry Jacobs, and find a lot of your work, a lot of stuff you've done. You've had an amazing career. It has been one of my great privileges in this business to get to know you and to have these kinds of conversations in press rooms with you, with maybe a few bad words thrown in there. and there's so much more. And I look forward to having more of those conversations in the future. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been an absolute pleasure for me. And I hope the people that are, hold on a second here. live podcasting there. Okay, there we go. Anyway, I hope everybody enjoyed this as much as I did and find your work out there because you are a treasure. Journalism is different now than it used to be when you cut your teeth. And one of my great privileges being in this business is you guys like you and some of the others, Colton Tudor and Lennox Rawlings, that I learned from and watched. And I hope that I'm able to continue on in some manner the way that I learned from you guys.
Well, I appreciate it, Andrew, and I appreciate seeing you in the press room whenever we do cross paths. And now you're as busy as I've ever seen you, but also deeply knowledgeable about what's going on in all aspects of Carolina sports. And so when I need to know something, I know where to turn. And I appreciate your inviting me and the nice things you had to say. And hopefully we'll find another player who comes along while we're still covering, who inspires us the way that Michael Jordan did.
Absolutely. And thank you very much. For Barry Jacobs, this is Andrew Jones. You've been listening to a special TarHeelIllustrated.com podcast. You can also watching us on Tar Heel Illustrated, our YouTube channel. If you like this, go ahead and click like. Go ahead and subscribe if you want to check out more of our stuff and hit that notification bell. We load a ton of content here on the YouTube channel from football, basketball, and recruiting. And if you're a Carolina fan, just scroll down on our YouTube channel. There's all kinds of great stuff that you can get lost in, especially since there's nothing else going on right now. Thank you, Barry. Appreciate it.
Okay, take care, Andrew.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for stopping by.